myself for 5 minutes. We had a good hearing last week where we talked about the need for openness and transparency. I believe it was Transparency Week. We have a bill here that would subject Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, to the Freedom of Information Act. A number of co-sponsors from our committee, including Mr. DeSantis, Mr. Russell, Mr. Duncan, Mr. Massey, Mr. Farenthold, Mr. Comer, Mr. Blum, Mr. Issa. Let's keep in mind that the taxpayers have already bailed out Fannie and Freddie, as they're affectionately called, to the tune of $187 billion. And when the American people bailed out Fannie and Freddie, it was the most sweeping government intervention in private financial markets in decades. We believe that the public has the right to know how these two entities have failed and what their obligations are to the American taxpayers moving forward. We believe that it is time that we apply the Freedom of Information Act to these two entities. The statute authorizing the FHFA's conservatorship over Fannie and Freddie granted it the power to exercise, quote, all rights, titles, powers, and privileges of the regulated entity and of any stockholder, officer, or director of such regulated entity, end quote. As such, these records became agency records for the purpose of a Freedom of Information Act when the FHFA took over as Fannie and Freddie's conservator. The bill merely clarifies what the plain language of the Freedom of Information Act already states. Government-controlled corporations like Fannie and Freddie are subject to a Freedom of Information Act request. There is precedent for applying FOIA to non-traditional quasi-government entities. Congress conferred FOIA applicability to Amtrak, for instance, in recognition of the substantial federal funds it receives. If Fannie and Freddie were to default, the taxpayers, we're the backstop, the men and women across this country, taxpayers are the backstop if Fannie and Freddie fail. Taxpayers would be on the hook for roughly $400 billion, not to mention $5 trillion in mortgage liabilities. $5 trillion. Those are substantial funds that should be subject to the FOIA. If you're going to become a quasi-government entity, the public has a right to know because we are the ones that have to foot the bill if something goes awry. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac cannot continue to be, quote unquote, just quasi-entities, end quote, for the purposes of avoiding a Freedom of Information Act request, but continue to enjoy the perks of government support in other areas like government charters and backing. Making matters worse, these entities have shown little regard for financial responsibility since their bailout. There is a new $56 million new headquarters in Washington, D.C. The compensation package for their executives is in the millions of dollars. At the same time, again, taxpayers had to go spend hundreds of billions of dollars to bail them out, and if they fail, taxpayers are going to be responsible for hundreds of billions of dollars, not to mention the $5 trillion in other issues that are out there. There are other scandals and things brewing, and I think the public just simply has the right to know. And I'd like to think that our committee, the people on this panel on both sides of the aisle, would help to champion the openness and transparency, and there are other government entities that we should probably tackle as well, that my guess is that Ms. Norton will bring up and talk about. So, with that, I'd like to encourage members to support the ANS and the underlying bill. And with that, I will yield back and now recognize Ms. Norton from the district.